In the second part of chapter 10, we are going to look at the relationship between utility and the demand curve. And in fact, we'll see that the downward slope of the market demand curve is explained by the utility maximizing behavior of our individual consumers. What we're looking at is that any quantity on the given demand curve is a utility maximizing quantity for that particular price. And of course, holding the income of the consumer constant. So let's see how we get that. You can assume that you're currently consuming a utility maximizing bundle. So you are consuming two goods, X and Y, and current consumption of X is X1 and current consumption of Y is Y1. At this current consumption, the per dollar marginal utility is equal for the two goods. Why? Because I'm assuming I'm at a utility maximizing consumption bundle. So this is my optimal quantity of X and Y given the prices of the two goods and the current income level. Let's assume now that the price of good X rises. So it's no longer the initial price P1, it rises to some higher level. As price of X rises and nothing else changes, you can see that this equality will now no longer hold. So we are no longer at an equilibrium according to our consumer preferences and our given budget line or the consumption possibilities. As price of X rises, I am no longer maximizing my utility from the consumption of these two goods. In fact, the per dollar marginal utility from X is lower now compared to the per dollar marginal utility that I'm getting from the consumption of Y. So what does the rational spending rule tells us? Whenever we are getting a higher per dollar marginal utility from the consumption of a particular good, it tells us that you must consume more of that good. And since we are on the budget line, as we consume more of Y, we must necessarily reduce our consumption of X. So as price of X is rising, rational spending rule is telling me I should consume less X. So with a higher price, we will land to a new consumption bundle, let's say X2 and Y2, where consumption of X is now lower than before and consumption of Y is higher than before compared to this optimal consumption bundle that we were working with initially. This is again a new optimal because this is corresponding to this new price combination. So if I put this on a two-dimensional space where I'm measuring price of X on the Y-axis and quantity of X on the X-axis, what do I get? This is my initial consumption bundle, only focusing on the consumption of X. So X1 corresponding to the initial price of P1. As price of X goes up, what is the optimal consumption rule telling us? That you should now consume less X and eventually you will reach your new optimal consumption bundle. This new optimal consumption bundle is optimal. Why? Because this is the new utility maximizing bundle when the price of X is at a higher level, price of Y remain the same, and the income of the consumer has not been affected. So holding everything else constant, as price of X went up, we are consuming a lower optimal quantity of X. Connecting these 2 points together, X1 is corresponding to point A, X2 is corresponding to point B, we get our downward sloping demand curve of X. So what do we have here? We can now apply this to any given point on our demand curve. So any given point on the demand curve is giving you optimal consumption of the good, or quantity demanded is reflecting the optimal quantity, a utility maximizing quantity of the good X, given the price of the good X, given the price of some related good, and given the income of the consumer. So all of these points on our demand curve are utility maximizing points or utility maximizing quantities of X corresponding to varying prices of X. We can also expand this concept a little further and see how do we actually move from point A to point B. This movement from point A to point B that we just saw as price of X went up can be split into two parts. The first effect is going to be called the substitution effect, and the second effect is income effect. Both these effects are arising because of change in the price of our good, and in this case price of X was going up. Substitution effect focuses on the effect on the consumption of a particular good when the relative price changes. So our relative price for good X would be Px over Py. In this case, Px has gone up, nothing happened to price of y. So good X has become relatively more expensive and good Y has become relatively cheaper. So relative price of y would be Py over Px, which is now lower than before. Whichever good is more cheaper or relatively cheaper in comparison to the other, substitution effect says that we should consume more of that good. So substitution effect of an increase in the price of X tells us that as X becomes more expensive, Y is becoming relatively cheaper, so you should consume more Y and you should consume less X, right? So you're consuming more of the relatively cheaper good and less of the relatively expensive good. If I'm focusing on just the relationship between X and its consumption, higher price of X makes us consume less X. That is the substitution effect of a change in the price of good X. So in short, substitution effect of an increase in the price of X tells us consume less X and consume more Y. Income effect looks at the effect of an increase in the price of a good on the purchasing power of the consumer. So here I'm assuming price of X has gone up. So as price of X increases, it reduces our ability to purchase good X and good Y. So overall, our affordability is being affected or our purchasing power is affected. Income effect can be different for different types of goods. This will now depend upon whether the good is a normal good, inferior good, or a Giffen good. For most goods, income effect and substitution effect will move in the same direction. So if substitution effect is saying consume less X, income effect would also say consume less X. But that's not always the case. For normal goods, yes, that will be the usual thing. Income effect and substitution effect will move in the same direction. If price of the good is going up, both income and substitution effect will say consume less X. But if you're working with inferior good and Giffen goods, we'll see that is not the case. So let's go over them one by one. For normal goods, remember, the income effect and substitution effect are moving in the same direction. What is a normal good? Normal good is a good that typically has a positive relationship with consumers' income. We saw that in chapter 3. As income goes up, you start buying more of the good. So the demand curve shifts to the right. Now we're looking at the income effect coming from increase in the price of X. So when price of X goes up, your purchasing power goes down and or real income decreases. And as real income decreases, if the good is a normal good, you should consume less of X. So substitution effect was saying it's relatively expensive, consume less X. Income effect of an increase in the price of X is saying also consume less X. So we can put this down here. As our purchasing power is reduced, we should consume less X because of the increase in price and its income effect. Higher price per dollar marginal utility is lower and you are going to consume less X. So both the substitution effect and income effect are saying here that as price of X rises, we are consuming less X. And this will give us our downward sloping demand curve. Let's put our demand curve over here. We have a relationship between price and quantity. And we were initially at point like A, where price of X was, let's say, P1. We were consuming some quantity X1. As price of X goes up, this movement from A to B is split now into two parts. Substitution effect says relatively X is now more expensive, so we should consume less X. Income effect, which is the as price goes up, purchasing power is reduced, X is a normal good, so consume less X. So you can see we are going to move from X1 here and then finally to here. So the total effect is decrease in the consumption of X all the way to X2. And this is now corresponding to the higher price of X, which is somewhere over here. And that gives us our coordinate point B. So this downward slope of the demand curve or movement between point A to B can be split into two parts, substitution effect and income effect. And for a normal good, note that they are both moving in the same direction. If the good is an inferior good, your substitution effect will not be different. Remember, that is just coming from the relative price of X. So substitution effect is still the same. Higher price of X, X is relatively more expensive, so consume less X. So nothing happening differently in the substitution effect. It's the income effect that's different. Income effect of an increase in the price of an inferior good is that, remember, for inferior goods, as income goes up, demand for the good goes down. So there's a negative or inverse relationship. So now as price of X goes up, your real income goes down. And as relationship between income and demand for the good is now a negative relationship, with real income declining, we should be consuming more of X. So note that the substitution effect and income effect are now moving in opposite direction. But if it's an inferior good, the substitution effect will always be outweighing your income effect. So your income effect will be partially offsetting the substitution effect, not fully. So what's happening? Price of X is rising and substitution effect is telling us consume less X, and income effect is telling us consume more of X. So opposite direction, but with the caveat that substitution effect outweighs our income effect. So in total, when price of X goes up, since substitution effect is the dominant one in this case, consumption of X will definitely be going down. So you will still get your downward sloping demand curve, or the relationship between price and quantity of X consumed is still negative. If I put this on a diagram, I have now initially at point A where I was consuming X1 units when price was P1. As price of X went up to P2, we have income effect and substitution effect moving in opposite direction. Substitution effect says X is relatively expensive, so consume less X. Income effect says X is an inferior good, so your relative purchasing power is now lower than before, so consume more X. So you can see income effect partially offsets our substitution effect. So total effect is the reduction in consumption of X from X1 to X2, not all the way over here. And this will correspond to now our point B somewhere over here, and that gives us our new coordinate point for the demand curve, and our downward sloping demand curve still holds. So the law of demand is still holding. As price of the good is going up, even for inferior goods, our demand curve is downward sloping, even though the underlying income effect is moving in the opposite direction of our substitution effect. Then there's a third case. In the third case, we have a special case of inferior goods. Given goods are those inferior goods for which the income effect outweighs the substitution effect. So remember, this is a special case of inferior good. So in this case, as income goes up, demand will decrease. As income decreases, demand for the good should go up. So inverse relationship over here. So income effect of an increase in the price of X would be purchasing power has been reduced. With lower purchasing power, I should be consuming more of X because this is an inferior good. Inverse relationship between income and the quantity consumed of the good. Let's summarize the two effects now. Substitution effect of an increase in the price of the good is telling us that as X is becoming more expensive, consume less of X because it's relatively more expensive. And income effect for a given good is consume more X. Purchasing power was reduced, you're consuming more X. But in this case, income effect is outweighing our substitution effect. So income effect will completely outweigh the substitution effect, and we end up actually consuming more of the good as price goes up. Remember, this is all coming from increase in the price of the good, and overall the net effect is, or the total effect is, we end up consuming more X. So here for a given good, as price of the good rises, consumption of the good actually rises. So instead of a typical downward sloping demand curve, we have a positive relationship between price and quantity demanded, and we'll have an upward sloping demand curve. Let's put that on our two-dimensional space. We have price and quantity measured on the two axes, and we're initially starting at point A where consumption of X is, let's say, at X1 and price is P1. As price of X rises to P2, we have substitution effect making us consume less X, but the income effect is moving in the opposite direction, and not only that, but it's completely going to offset this substitution effect. So we actually end up with a total consumption of X which is higher than before. And this higher consumption corresponds to your new price level and gives you a coordinate point like B. And connecting these 2 points, we have our upward sloping demand curve for this good. For Giffen goods, we have an upward sloping curve, a demand curve, or a positive relationship between price and quantity of the good. Now, there are very few goods which are Giffen goods. Historically, we saw that during the Great Depression, bread was a Giffen good. As prices of bread were going up because of shortages, and we saw that people were still consuming more and more bread. Because bread was a staple item, all other things were even more expensive than bread. So people still had to consume at least some bread to satiate themselves. So even though price of the good was going up, people kept consuming more and more of this good because their purchasing power was drastically reduced. With that drastic reduction in their purchasing power, they kept consuming more bread rather than rice or eggs or beef or other type of dairy products, etc. So everything else is now more expensive. So you'd rather just still consume more bread. So here we saw historically we have the example of bread during the Great Depression or in times of crisis, massive shortages. We see an upward sloping demand for a staple item like bread. That brings us to the end of chapter 10. This was just a little supplementary part to our understanding of the demand curve and how it is related to utility maximizing behavior. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll see you guys next time when we do chapter 11 next week.